I have indeed no abhorrence of danger except in its absolute effect, in terror. Greetings, Poe fans. We are excited to bring you another episode of
The
6 Degrees of Edgar Allan Poe.
Poe.
We are the Poe-tastic 2. My name is Carmen Bolden.
And I'm Jeanie Smith.
And we are going to talk about horror this evening.
Oh, all the good stuff. The scares. The wonderful, wonderful world of being scared. Yes, don't do that to me.
Sorry. All right.
Fragile.
So, Jeanie.
Yes.
What is the definition of horror?
I am so glad you asked, Carmen. The definition is the intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that could incorporate in so many different ways and so many different things. But truly, if you think about it, it's either something you see, you smell, you taste, you hear, or you touch. So it incorporates all 5 senses. And in some people, the 6th sense, too.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, it has to touch, I think, at least one sense of who you are to create that horrible feeling.
You know, and I hadn't really thought about that until you just kind of put it in that perspective, but it really makes sense. And that's probably why it's, it really, it kind of, like many other genres of, variabilities, don't have that.
No,
not all of the senses.
I mean, because if you think about it,
yeah.
I mean, television, movies, books, they each touch upon different senses.
Yes.
Very rarely do you get all the senses in one point in the genre. So, but writing would definitely, what you read hits more than anything else, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. And speaking of reading, one of the books that I did for research, and not for just for this episode, but for other episodes further down the road, is The Price of Fear, and this was by Joel Eisner. And one of the things that Vincent Price, probably the Prince of Terror, I don't,
Prince of Darkness, I think is what he was, his moniker when he was in movies and stuff.
He's one of the main ones. And if you have not watched anything Vincent Price, you need to go quickly and do that because he's amazing. Absolutely.
And I mean, if anybody doesn't know who Vincent Price is, you have to know who Michael Jackson is.
Yes.
So if you want to know who Vincent Price is, go watch the video, The Thriller, by Michael Jackson, and there you will find the man, the myth, the legend of Vincent Price.
Woohoo! And that is a pop culture reference too.
Yep, it is.
All right. So from what Vincent Price said, I believe that horror films must be logical. You must be able to believe some part of it. Not all of it, but you must be able to believe it could happen. Otherwise, it is not frightening. And I think those are powerful words. And, because sometimes I've heard some people say that they don't want to watch fiction, TV shows, movies, or whatever. It's like it's not believable. But many things are, stem from true stories.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that a lot of directors, producers, writers have come to find is the more believable you can make it, the more it touches upon the person's senses.
And scarier it is.
6th sense, because that's the one thing we all know that not everybody feels it.
Right.
But some people do believe that there is something else out there.
Right.
And just like Shakespeare said, Mercutio, there are more things, between heaven and earth than what we know. And I'm paraphrasing, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
I cannot remember the exact quote, but it's Shakespeare.
Exactly.
And that's what the definition, like Vince Price said, horror is making it as believable as possible. That's why when I watch what some people think are horror films, they become comedy for me because I just laugh.
Right. and kind of like what we were talking about earlier this evening when we were kind of outlining the episode, is that true horror is that unseen, that the fear of the unknown that lurks in the background, and then you don't see it at all, or maybe at the very end. But then that subgenre of the slasher flicks and things like that came out of horror in the late 70s, really. I mean, there's some before that, but when it really spiked.
Yeah, because it was that genre that came about to where you're like, really? It's just like it was a cookie cutter. Like most things, when they jump on the bandwagon of a theme,
right,
it's like it has to go and go until apparently they've beat you to death with it. But the first person and the true horror that we could probably think of in historical aspect of writing is the wonderful writer Miss Mary Shelley.
Yes, and I think we have actually mentioned her before when we were talking about science fiction, but she is the queen.
Yes, I mean she put upon this genre. I can't think of any other word right now. Sorry, I keep saying the same thing.
Yeah.
But in literature,
yes,
she took a dare. Because she was married to Lord Byron Shelley.
Literally a dare.
Yeah, and they were sitting around with supper. Who else was it? It was Lord Byron.
Yes.
And then there was like 2 or 3 other males. They were all sitting around at home one night, and they all came up with a dare to each other of who could write the worst scary story.
Yes.
And Mary Shelley said, "I'm in on this." She may not have said it exactly those words because they used mostly real language, not the slang, but she made it happen, and she wrote the wonderful story of Frankenstein, which she actually called it Prometheus at first because she kind of alluded to the mythological titan Prometheus, that he was real but he wasn't real. And then she created Frankenstein in 1818 on January the 1st when it was published. And she became known as a horror writer.
Yes.
Because even though you put together this book, and she put together the book kind of like she put together Frankenstein.
Yes.
Because you never really saw or even came across who he truly was until the very end. Because it was always just an illusion of this deranged psychopath doctor who was trying to build a person. And that at that time was so out there. But if you think about it, we are looking in times of when Frankenstein is kind of real today.
I agree, yes.
I mean, organ donors. There was just recently, I was telling Carmen earlier about the article of where they transplanted a pig's heart into a human man. And he was doing very successful. And he actually lived, I think it was 6 to 7 weeks. And the heart didn't
That is unreal.
Yeah, and I mean, that in itself is like, oh, wait. So Frankenstein in the early 1800s was just this mass, what do you call it, fantasy,
yes,
I guess.
Yeah.
And now it's not so much a fantasy, it's science.
Yes.
But she won the dare.
Yes, and I was looking this up while you were giving this history, and it was her lover, Percy Bysshe Shelley, her stepsister, Claire Claremont, and also Lord Byron, and that they went to Geneva, and that's where that came about.
Yeah, and that was a thing. And the other thing with Mary Shelley is she refused to have it published under a man's name.
Yes.
She said, I wrote this, I'm a woman, and it's going to be published under my name if it gets published, and it was.
Yes.
And she was, in my opinion, she was the first step for feminism.
Yeah, I mean, really and truly. And at that time, with all the power authors of that of that age, that was a big step for her. And I think it's amazing that the book took as well as it did.
Yeah, and I think it helped because her lover, Lord Percy, I mean, he was a lord too.
I think so.
Yeah, Lord Byron and Lord Percy.
All the lords.
It helped because
the lords of literature.
Of his affluence, we might as well say.
Yeah.
That helped it along too.
Oh, absolutely.
But still,
and Byron too.
Yeah, and she refused. She said, nope, you're going to publish it under my name. No mail, no abbreviations, nothing. It's going to be mine and mine alone. And so it was, to me, the true stepping stone of building that horror, because it was not a known thing, because science was still getting off the ground.
Exactly.
we didn't have what we have now with all of the wonderful ERs and
No.
everything.
And just like kind of we were talking about earlier, Poe would have been 9 years old when that was published.
Yes.
So I could totally see him reading that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it would make perfect sense if he had,
Mm-hmm.
because that would be right up his wheelhouse.
Absolutely. And then not very long after that, in 1832, he published his first horror story, and the title is Metzengerstein. And I'm not going to give too much away. It is a very well-written story. It's a short story. It involves a horse
Mm-hmm.
and some family feuding,
Oh,
a little fire,
of course, you
and
got to bring the fire into it.
and madness, and that's all I'm going to say.
I
but
think
it's
that
very
can
good.
describe every bit of Edgar Allan Poe's stories right there. Boom.
Yes, yes,
Just say madness. Hey, it's Edgar Allan Poe.
yes.
Yeah, and it sounds a lot like another story that comes along a little later from another guy that, all I'm going to say is the character Ichabod Crane.
Yes.
And so you got to say, I wonder where he come up with that idea.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Poe. Hello, Poe.
There's some, there are some, a few similarities here and there, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the thing.
That
And
was our first thought when we were talking about it.
Yeah, and like we always said, that one of the greatest accolades is imitation of your art.
Absolutely.
Imitation of who and where and what. So, but yes, The Raven, as we talked about earlier, was the only poem, I guess, that we could say that kind of fit with the horror definition.
Mm-hmm.
But all the rest of his short stories that we brought up in a timeline, like we said, the Metzinger, which I think
Metzingerstein. And just, I looked this up. So The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, published in 1820. So Poe may have done had a little inspiration from Mr. Irving.
Yeah, because, I mean, that works. It's like right there in between.
Absolutely. But the stories are definitely different enough that it's not plagiarism.
No. But, imitation.
Yes.
When you got something that works, you go with it. That theme, that genre, all that wonderful literature.
Exactly. And I think, Jeannie, what was the first of Poe's stories, like with the big ones? Like, because some of these are not as well known. You need to read them, though. I'm in the middle of reading all of his short stories. I started last year, and my goal was to finish this year. And I'm probably a little over halfway through.
Well, from the listing that we've got here after Metzingerstein, which I think it's kind of funny, it's close to Frankenstein.
Yes.
We have in 1834 was Assignation.
The Assignation, yes.
The Assignation. And then 1835, there was 3. We had Bernice, Morella, and then Shadow of a Parable.
Yes.
And those were all in that same year. And then after that, you had William Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had, of course, the House of Usher.
Yes, Fall of the House of Usher.
Yes. And that looks like that's all the ones that took place in the 1830s.
Okay. And Morella and Berenice and Fall of the House of Usher are some of the big ones.
Yes, and then the rest of them are pretty much all early 40s.
Okay.
We have The Black Cat, of course, in 43. We have Premature Burial, 44. We can only assume what that's about.
Yes.
Oblong Box, which I think is kind of funny, is also 44.
Yes.
Maybe we know what's going on there, too.
Yes. And boxes, cats.
Yes. Input Perverse.
Imp of the Perverse.
Imp of the Perverse.
Yes.
Can't read my own writing, sorry.
That's okay.
The Hop Frog was his last one, and that was 1849.
Yes. A Tale of Revenge.
Yes, and then, of course, we can't leave out The Cask of Amontillado.
Yes, one of my favorites.
Mask of the Red Death. The Pit and the Pendulum. Oval Portrait, which, by the way, sounds a lot like something else I've heard of. What was that? Oh, yeah, The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yes. Love that book, too.
So, and
that's Oscar Wilde,
yeah.
If you didn't know.
Yeah, good guy, too.
Yes.
But, yeah, and then Telltale Heart in 1843.
Okay.
So all those were like 40s. In the 30s, it was like a lot of the little short stories that I don't think a lot of people have read.
No. I mean, again, in high school, middle school, high school, junior high, whichever, you went to, as a kid, certain ones are chosen for those grade levels, and that's what a lot of people read.
Yes.
What I found very interesting this particular week, and just so you guys know, I changed school systems, and so I'm now teaching freshman honors at a high school. And so we're getting them ready for their testing coming up and working on writing. And we read The Raven and another short, or a poem, I should say, The Cremation of Sam McGee.
Oh, yeah, I love that one.
By Robert Service, and it's a comparison piece. But anyway, I asked the students, how many of you have read The Raven? Very few had. Some read it 6th grade, some read it 8th grade, and then a couple of them said, I read it for funsies because I love Poe, and that melted my heart.
Oh, yeah, it's great that you can still have those that are dedicated to literature and reading it, even though social media kind of has taken the long and the arduous of reading and interpretation and just cut it down to the nitty-gritty.
Exactly, yeah.
But I do like that they're turning a lot of older pieces of classic literature into the graphic novels to try to draw in the younger crowd.
Yes.
And it's that stimulus. It's that thing because in today's society, a lot of people are used to not only just reading something, but they're listening, interacting, and so they need that stimulus for say.
I agree, and I also like to, just because I'm a TV person, Netflix is coming out with that series called the Fall of the House of Usher,
right?
And I don't know that they've released the date
No,
yet,
I haven't seen it.
but that's exciting because I think a lot of young people, adults, everybody will probably watch that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, because most people don't have time to sit and read.
Exactly.
And even listening to a book on tape sometimes doesn't give you enough time.
No, you're right.
So just getting to the nitty-gritty is where it falls. And that's like with Poe and the horror, like the Telltale Heart. The Telltale Heart, to me, fits the definition of horror so much because it's the illusion of hearing something, but you never see it.
Yes.
You just are going off of a man's madness because his senses are not getting it.
Exactly.
Like,
well, and what's kind of interesting too, because you mentioned the sound of the heart, but before that, it was the visual of the eye.
Yep.
And that's what drove him mad to kill him.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about how some people that are classifying horror movies, they're not, in our opinion, actual classic horror, because the definition of horror, it needs to have that disgust factor, that shock factor, that fear. And most of the great ones have where you don't really see the protagonist.
Exactly.
It's just a build up, like Jaws. We were talking about Jaws earlier.
Yes, 1975. You don't see the actual whole shark until the very end of the movie.
Yeah.
It's very close to the end, and you've got this unknown figure of, you see the fin, you hear the music, and that is, if the music wasn't there, you would not have the horror.
No, and your mind is building that fear based on what you've been told, what has, because sharks, we've all been told. Evidence. Sharks are not our friends,
Right.
They like to chew off pieces of people. So they went off of that own mind that you have created of that fear.
Exactly.
And then the disgust of what would happen if you were attacked. And then the shock value of, that can't be happening to me.
Yes, and then this ties very closely to 1897 with Bram Stoker writing Dracula. And if you haven't read the book, you need to. And I had seen many variations of the movie. Bela Lugosi in the original. It's my favorite version, but also Gary Oldman's Keanu Reeves version. It's good too.
Yeah, that would be. I tie in the Bela Lugosi and the Keanu Reeves one. They're kind of tied for me.
Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely a Keanu Reeves fan, but I'm also a fan of Bela Lugosi.
Yes.
But the one thing that I loved most about Bram Stoker's book is it was written in a diary type mentality.
Yes.
And so that was something different.
Mm-hmm.
And so he hit upon that, because if you can put yourself in that empathetic and that sympathetic wave of who you're reading, and you become that person,
right,
then you're adding more to the factor and creating more of a fear and entering in the horror.
Yes. And so when I read the book, I was kind of taken aback because I had this anticipation of what it was going to be. Mm-hmm. And it was very different in a very good way. And I don't want to give too much away if you have not read it, but it has a huge scare factor in that unknown terror, and that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. I mean, the fear of the unknown is the topmost factor for all of us when it comes to what we fear in this world. And so, like with Bram Stoker, we always say that Bram Stoker used the Vlad the Impaler as his model.
History base,
his model or his illusion in the creation of Dracula, because Vlad the Impaler was a true man in the history that he would strike fear into his enemies by impaling the heads of his enemies on his gate.
Right.
But what was truly that, they never really proved this, but it was like one of those legends, is that before he cut off their head, he would drain their bodies of all their blood, and then he would bathe in it and drink it.
Yes.
To make himself stronger and to make himself more feared.
Exactly.
And so that goes right along with the definition of horror. The fear, the disgust, because just the thought of someone drinking someone's blood is disgusting.
Yes, it is. It's very disgusting.
And the shock value of how can someone do that? I mean, cannibalism.
Yeah.
We don't think of that in modern society as being real, but in some aspects of the world today, there are still cannibal tribes.
Yes, absolutely.
And so it's one of those things that it just all plays together, but the true horror has to be built up in your own mind to reach your own fear, your own shock value, and your own disgust level. In
your own imagination of the whatever dream you're thinking of.
Yeah, the creation of that horror in your mind of who the protagonist is.
Yes.
Because most of the time, the creation of the protagonist in your own mind is more fearful than someone creating it for you.
I agree. And, Poe influenced multiple people in this genre. This is probably what he's most known for with the mainstream. Yeah. And, he influenced Stephen King. He influenced H.P. Lovecraft. And probably,
Hitchcock.
Alfred Hitchcock and, Vincent Price, Roger Corman, who directed all of the Poe movies that Vincent Price was in. And, even probably Bram Stoker as well.
Yes, because his was posted in 1897, May 25th.
Yes.
So almost, 80 years after Frankenstein?
Yes.
1818 to 1897.
Yeah, and then from looking at when Poe died in 1849, so you've got
roughly about 40 years between that time. So there has to be some ways, because he couldn't just, he could.
Right.
But more than likely, the epitome of creating something is always taking something that's touched you and then creating it with something of your own.
Exactly.
And to me, Bram Stoker did that by writing in a diary type genre, which is not really done a lot in today's society. We're always used to the narrative, the explanatory, the short story, those kinds of things. That's regular literature.
One of the only books that, and I never did get to finish it, it's a big book, is The Book Thief, written in Death's perspective, and kind of in a diary letter in a way. It's loose, but that reminds me of that a little, just a little.
Well, and then you can go back into a little bit of history and say, well, if you think about it, Virgil, Dante's Inferno, and all that is more that they were trying to draw the reader in as being that person in that perspective.
Yes.
If you can drag a person into the story and make them recreate the story in their own mind, then that's the best way you've got them.
Yeah, I agree.
And Stephen King, we were talking about this earlier. Stephen King has to have been a reincarnation, in my opinion, of Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes.
Because macabre is very much Stephen King.
Yes, and the shock value, the mystery, the true mystery that horror brings out. Mm-hmm. He does such a very good job. When I read Dracula, it was not what I expected.
Nope.
When I read The Shining, I go back to the episode of Friends when Joey has to put the book into the freezer because he's too scared.
Yes.
I never had that fear that Joey had.
Right.
But there were parts in it that scared me because of that unknown factor.
Right. And that's one of the things that Stephen King does so much.
Yes.
Like the Tommy knockers. I mean, that one thing that just hits me even now. It's been a long time since I read the book or even saw the movie.
Yes.
But I still have that jingle in my head, Tommy knockers knocking at your door.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just goes with that to where it touched that much. And like The Stand, the miniseries of The Stand, that was very much using what a person fears the most to create the story.
Yes. And we were also talking about Pet Sematary, and I listen to that book. Sometimes I read, holding the book in my hand, reading, and then sometimes I listen to books, and that was one I listened to because Michael C. Hall, the actor who plays Dexter, read a version of it, and I was like, oh, Dexter, Stephen King, Pet Sematary, cats, dead cats. I mean, just I was like, this is all the cool things.
Oh, yeah.
And so, and he did a very good job, by the way. And, I think back to, The Black Cat. Did Stephen King get a little inspiration from that?
Yeah, and that's the thing. We can always think about things as true influences, but sometimes things influence us without even knowing.
Yes.
It could have been something that happened to us when we were children.
Yes.
And we never even remembered it or thought of it until boom, it's like, wait a minute. This seems like deja vu.
Yes.
Why do I feel this way? And then you're like, oh, now I remember.
Yes.
So, and another one is his Salem's Lot.
Okay, that's one I have not read.
Yeah, it's been a while too, but it's just Misery. I cannot even stand. I love it, but talk about macabre.
Yes.
And talk about Kathy Bates. She's
and it's
a great
kind of
actress.
It's kind of that dark satire as well, and Poe did much of that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why Misery gets me so much when I talk about Edgar Allan Poe, is because Edgar Allan Poe was all about psychological.
Yes.
He was like what he might have been feeling, the psyche. He was bringing it in there. And with Misery, with Stephen King, you can actually think that this could happen. In some ways, it has happened to some people, like serial killers and those kind of things.
Yes.
I don't want to give the whole story away if you haven't read it, but building on what we are ingrained to fear from childhood till adulthood, some people are fear of spiders, some people snakes. Those are natural fears.
Mine sharks.
Yeah, and I think it's funny that she always watches Jaws.
It's shark therapy.
Yeah. Well, that's like with me, it's airplane disasters. It's kind of weird.
Yes.
But I get so hung up on airplane disasters, and it drives my friends crazy, especially if I'm about to get on an airplane. I always get stuck with
Trust me, it drives us crazy. We have to talk her off the wing.
Oh, yes. It is wild, but those are just some of the things.
Yes.
And it's all psychological.
Yes, and mine stems from two things. My brother and a friend were babysitting me one night, and I said, you have to tuck me into bed just like Mom and Dad do. So they, got into bed, and they were like, okay, good night. And I'm like, you got to tuck my feet. And he was like, or no, I'm sorry, I'm getting the story wrong. So I was about to go to sleep, and he goes, well, we're going to tuck your feet. And I'm like, why? I don't want my feet, all snug.
Yeah.
And he said, well, there's a land shark that lives under your bed, and if your feet aren't tucked, it's going to eat your feet. So
brothers.
till this day, my feet tuck. I just automatically do it.
Yeah.
It's psychological.
Yeah, he ingrained that fear in
Yes.
your mind, and it was always just, it's not something that happened. It's just an unknown
Yes.
that you've been billed, and that's just like with me and the airplane disasters. It's like most of that is due to human error. Which, by the way, I have trust issues. When it, and it sounds like Carmen does too, because her brother gave her that.
Yes.
I think my brother gave me my trust issues because he was always waiting to drive me crazy.
Yeah.
He was much older than me. He is much older than me.
My brothers as well. Yes.
Now, gotta love to torture those siblings.
Absolutely.
But Stephen King, and then, sorry, but you can think Edgar Allan Poe is the psychological horror.
Yes.
Because he, in Telltale Heart, he just builds it.
Mm-hmm.
Mask of, Red Death. You don't really see death.
No.
You can't see death coming. And that's one of the unknowns.
Mm-hmm.
And he built that so much because all these people were trying to escape death, and all they did was walk into his clutches.
Exactly. And just that shock value, and just, it's just, I love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
Oh, and then being buried alive. Walled in while you're still alive.
And
Amontillado.
many of Poe's stories have that. And I think I read somewhere, I think that Poe may have been afraid of that happening, which back in that time frame, the whole,
the Black Death was happening, and people were dying, but they weren't. It was
right.
like one of the last things of the illness was most people were mistakenly dead.
Yes.
But they weren't. It's just that lowered their heart rate and everything. And then people didn't know how to check. And so they were buried alive.
Yes. And that's where the Saved by the Bell comes from, where the bell would be out above the ground with a string down into the coffin. And if somebody did wake up, they would ring the bell, and they'd be saved by the bell, because then they would dig them up.
Yeah, that's why they had night groundskeepers at the cemetery with all the bells hanging around on the cemeteries, because if you heard a bell ringing when the bell tolls, Edgar Allan Poe, when the bell tolls, that means that person was buried alive. And some people, they ended up, their last breath was taken in their own coffin.
Exactly.
So you want to talk about fear? Yes, I think Edgar Allan Poe, he was very much, that was his biggest fear in that time frame, because disease was rampant. His mother died of tuberculosis.
Yes, and that was rampant.
Yeah, his wife died of tuberculosis. So that's why I think Edgar Allan Poe is so great in the macabre, is because he touches upon all our unknown fear of death. Yes. Because as many times as we want to say that we are prepared, or we know, or we feel, or we just don't, some people just don't believe in an afterlife at all, which is, fine.
Right. Everybody has their own beliefs, and that's
perfectly okay.
Absolutely.
But most people always have that fear of the unknown. Yes. And we can't handle that. The mortality of it all. Yeah, and
it goes back to a control factor when you think of that.
And take into account Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone, he was so good at building that unknown, that fear factor, that disgust factor, that shock value. Yes. Because you never knew what was going to come out of that man's mind.
No, absolutely not. And he was one of the writers for the show, along with other ones. And there's one episode, and when we do more of an individual episode, there's an Alfred Hitchcock episode from the TV show that Robert Bloch wrote. It's from a short story, but he wrote it, he put it to the screen. And Robert Bloch is the one who wrote the book that Psycho, the movie, was made from, about Ed Gein, the serial killer. So all of this, just the macabre, is just all these connections.
They were very smart because they know what works. Yes. They know what works. They know how to get in it. And one of the things that was recreated in the early black and white movies when they first getting sound was Frankenstein. Yes. One of the earliest was the 1934 version. I can't remember who played in it at the moment because it's been a while.
Yeah. But Boris Karloff.
But I would use that in my theater classes to teach about how you don't always have to give the audience every single thing.
Yes.
It's all about building the suspense, building that terror, that fear, that shock, that disgust value. And, you know, most people think Frankenstein is the bad guy. Well, technically, Frankenstein is, because Frankenstein was not the monster. Frankenstein was the scientist.
Yes.
And most people forget that.
And the monster has no name.
Exactly. He is literally the complete unknown. But in essence, he is the fear that everyone carries inside them.
Yes.
And that's kind of like what Frankenstein was building.
Yeah.
That mad scientist, he was trying to recreate something that wasn't fearful.
Yes.
And in essence, he created the most feared being of all.
Yes.
You know, and that's one of the things of those twists that we have to go for. But as Carmen said, later on when we do individual podcasts, we're going to be more in depth, especially like with Alfred Hitchcock.
Yes, Vincent Price.
We're going to talk a lot about, one of my favorite playwrights was Eugene O'Neill. And Eugene O'Neill and Edgar Allan Poe kind of had a lot in common.
Yes.
But we're going to bring that in when we do more in depth. You know, right now we're just looking into the six steps
overview,
of his overview. And then in later episodes with season 2, we're going to narrow it down even farther.
Yes.
And so...
And we're excited about that.
Yes, very much so. But we would like to, once more, bring you into our world of Edgar Allan Poe. We have our website, which is 6degreesofpoe.com. We have a Twitter.
Yes. We
got to do the Twitter. We haven't got an Instagram yet, but I'm working on that. I'm actually creating a TikTok and YouTube channel.
Yes, and we have Facebook. Everything is 6 Degrees of Poe. And we also have an Etsy shop, which we are starting. We'll have the same items on our website as well. And some really exciting news in Lebanon, Tennessee, on June 4th. We're going to have a booth at the Rotten Revival put on by the Nashville Curiosities group, and you can check them out on Facebook as well. But we are going to have a booth there promoting our podcast, and also selling some items. We have some stickers from our art that we do, and some other items that we're working on, and we're really excited about it.
Yeah, and we would love if you happen to be in this area to come out and join us on that day.
Yes.
If not, stay tuned. We are going to have a YouTube channel and a TikTok, and that one is going to be called the Potastic 2.
Yes.
Because it's going to be more centered to video feeds.
Yes.
When we do our Poe Unplugged, our book club type thing, we are going to video record those, and we're going to post those so people can still be a part of it, even if you weren't not allowed, if you just happen not to be there that night or join. So we just want to make sure that we're getting everybody out, getting you informed of what we're doing. We want to increase your love of Edgar Allan Poe like we have ours. And so please come out, continue listening to our podcasts. Please look up our websites. We're going to be doing a lot social media. We're just getting a slow start because between life and this, life sometimes doesn't allow us to do a lot of things.
Yes, but we are getting there, and we'll have a lot of more time this summer as well when we have some time off.
Yes, that would be a great thing. That we're going to do a little traveling maybe, and we may do some podcasts from on site of places we're going to visit that has Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes.
It goes with our last episode for the season, Poe Places, which that will be next time.
Yes, it will.
So,
and for Poe Unplugged for April, we're going to have to change the date because Jeanie and I are taking a class with the
Citizens Academy.
Yes, to learn more about what all of our wonderful sheriffs in the area do. And so we're going to have to move the date in April, and so we will have that announced on all of our social media sites very, very soon, probably by this weekend.
Yes, please continue to tag us and share us,
our page, and
follow all those wonderful
keywords.
Yes,
listen,
share. I don't know what else to call them.
Yeah, I was
What
trying to
else
think
are
of
they?
some other L words for alliteration purposes, just to keep it the poetic theme. But
Yes. Link.
yes,
There's
Link.
another
There you
one.
go.
Woohoo! I got one. Hey. But yeah, because social media is a great advertisement for
Yes.
us. And we hope you are enjoying our podcast as much as we enjoy it. We try
Yes.
to get you as involved as possible, and we want to get you informed.
Exactly.
Because that's one of the major aspects, because that's the teachers in us.
Yes. And also send us an email, 6degreesofpo@gmail.com.
And then we also will have potastic2@yahoo.com.
Yes.
If you want to talk just not strictly to Poe, but to us, you can email us there, because that's what our YouTube and our TikTok will be under.
Yes.
Since it's more video feed, and we're going to be doing a lot more different things other than just our podcasts on those.
Exactly.
And we're so glad people are joining us, and we hope to share our love, and you get excited as we do.
Yes. We love Poe, and we want to share Poe with the world. So.
Yes. And at the end of that, we will say,
We are Poe out.
Words have no power to impress the mind without the exquisite horror of their reality.